So let's go to Pompeii. And Pompeii in the 1st century Common Era. Any of the dates for any of the buildings, the volcano erupted in 79, and so 60 is probably the safe date if you want to guesstimate on everything that's from Pompeii. Now, Pompeii has been fascinating for people because in the 1800s they started excavating it, and it was a really big deal that they discovered it. And it was basically, I was told that it was a small resort town, but I've gotten conflicting information about that, whether it was just a regular town or a small town that was a sort of resort town. But let's take a look at why it's so important. Basically, if you look at this map, it's in the Bay of Naples, right outside of Naples there, and it's further down the coast from Rome. And if it was a resort town, and there is some evidence that that it could have been used as a sort of getaway for some Romans, they could have actually sailed down it. They could have taken a ship down the coast and ended up right at Pompeii and enjoyed their life there. Now, in some ways, this town is the most important city that we'll study because it tells us the most about Roman life and times, kind of like how I was discussing how Greek pottery did in the ancient and archaic periods of ancient Greece and classical Greece. The pottery tells us a lot, and the stuff from the funerals. Well, this whole town, there were actually several towns. The two most notable, Herculaneum and Pompeii themselves, were actually sealed by a volcanic disturbance. It starts probably around 60 Common Era, and there was an earthquake, and this extensive earthquake created some kind of conflict and a lot of economic issues for the surrounding areas. But they were able to sort of rebuild Pompeii and Bosco Real and Herculaneum and fix some things up. And there's also a little town called Stabia where there's a bath that you might study in one of your other classes. What happened by 79 AD was this volcano basically belched, and for about 12 to 15 hours there was a series of ash and gravel and gases thrown into the air that rained down on all the towns around it. And unfortunately, what happened was also the gas rolled down the hill at something like 79 or 80 miles an hour. So it would be very hard for people to get away from it and to escape into the bay. And we have accounts of what it looked like from Pliny the Younger, who was obviously the son of Pliny the Elder. There were firsthand accounts from being on the sea and looking up and seeing what was happening in the distance. And apparently Pliny the Elder, I think, died going in to try to rescue or look at things. And Pliny the son recorded seeing the events, and it's recorded in a letter. So you can look that up if you're more interested. So what happens then is this rain of ash, which is super hot, I think something around 800 degrees Fahrenheit, rains down on the city, but people would have been almost instantaneously asphyxiated, but not everybody was. And then with rains that came after it and the ashes settling, it actually kind of sealed the entire surface with this dust and concrete-like substance that preserved everything underneath it. So of course some things would have been burnt and would have been petrified, but a lot of the buildings, a lot of the frescoes, and even some of the people's bodies and even some of the bones were preserved. So this site is this enormous treasure trove for archaeologists. It was very unfortunate for the people at the time. I'm sure it was horrible to die that way, but for us it's a really great resource to find out what the Romans lived like. First of all, what we know about the town itself is that, like most Roman towns, it was really well organized. It had a series of major roads. The Cardo, which is the major heart road, Cardo Maximus. It had upper and lower main streets, the decumanuses or decumani. And then it also had a series of districts. There was a theater district. There was an amphitheater. There were theaters that were built there. There was also, I suppose, divided up into some kind of other economic distinctions as well, with some temples. The tradition of theaters in Pompeii and in the Roman world is kind of an interesting thing because it relates somewhat. In my class, I made my students read the Bacchae, which is this Greek tragedy, and it's going to color my lecture on this. So you might want to review that Greek tragedy by Euripides yourself. And what these amphitheaters were basically initially theaters that were built to entertain the people, but early in the Roman civilization, they actually believed that acting and theater was crass and rude, which is kind of funny because they were such a dramatic people. But we have these two major theaters and amphitheaters that were there, and racetracks. And they had a Colosseum-like structure as well as a racetrack and an amphitheater. And so this Colosseum was not functioning at the time of the volcanic eruption. I think that what happened was, and we can see this in this fresco from Pompeii, that actually represents a riot that happened in the amphitheater, and Rome actually shut down their rights to have gladiatorial games at their sort of amphitheater where they would see those kinds of sports events, because there was this sort of revolt or I guess it was sort of like a soccer riot that happened there. And what we see in this fresco is actually a clear depiction of the riot that was going on inside and the riot that was going on outside. And unlike the Colosseum that we studied, the Flavian Amphitheater in Rome, this was a little different of a construction because all the steps that allowed people to get in and out were located on the exterior of the building. And we've got this wonderful document in the form of a fresco that tells us what it looked like and what the riot was about. We also have written records that express this. Now, this map that we're looking at really lays out an awful lot of the different kinds of places and different theaters and that kind of stuff. And so we're going to be visiting a bunch of the houses inside, and we can see that there are a series of theaters and a series of gymnasiums and public baths and a forum and marketplaces. And so, in short, this town itself was extremely well organized, extremely well put together. The roads that ran in and out were standard width. There was actually standard axle widths. And there was a form of architecture that really allowed the people to enjoy life in this town and also enjoy economic benefits from the architecture and how it was built. So we're going to study that. First off, if you look at the roads, you can see that in the middle of the road, these three things that we would probably mistake as boulders, they're actually stepping stones, and they had a sort of sewage system that ran underneath. So the roads were a standard width, and they had these stepping stones that when the roads filled up with water, people could walk from one side of the sidewalk to the other side of the sidewalk and not have to get their feet wet. Now, those stones also had the added benefit of being speed bumps, because if you were riding a carriage down there, you'd have to have a standard width of an axle to be able to fit between them, and you'd also have to have a standard height. And if you're trying to go too quickly, you might run into one of these boulders and it would crack your axle or crack your wheels. So one of the things that they were trying to do is this is a form of actually traffic control. And there's documentation in many cultures that in the middle of towns with a lot of carriages running back and forth, that people would get run over sometimes by horses and carriages. One of the things that the Romans are thinking about is basically a kind of civic ordinance in which they're enforcing law, and they're actually even enforcing traffic regulations and building codes. Now, in the 1800s and the 1900s, with the archaeological craze, Pompeii had this incredible influence on the culture. So just to step outside and talk about the context a little bit. In the late 1700s, there was this guy named Johann Jacob Winkelmann who wrote a book on the imitation of Greek on Greek art. And what he was really sort of pushing was a rebirth or a reuse, another sort of re-renaissance, referring back to the classical world. And in the 1780s, right around the same time that this was really being worked on, when they were excavating it an awful lot, one of the things that was happening, for instance, in France was Jacques-Louis David, who was a great classical painter, and he did a version of the Death of Socrates that we looked at earlier, was painting portraits in the classical style. So the excavations at Pompeii had a strong influence on this. One of the things that they discovered when they were excavating Pompeii was that somebody got the idea that if you poured plaster into these holes that they were finding, that they would that it would retain the shape after you remove the rock. And what they discovered were the bodies of people who had fallen in place. And I don't think that they're actually bones. I think that that the gases created cavities and the bodies were basically destroyed, but that the hollows from the gases expanding were their bodies. I'm not exactly sure how all of this works, but it's kind of gory.